Who was California Jim? Although a rather elderly man when I was a growing boy, I knew him very well. He was born James Robinson Northup Jr. in 1830 at the old Northup homestead off Rodman Street in Peacedale, now Wild Acres Farm, home of Mr. and Mrs. Milton Kelly. He left Wakefield in the early 1850s to take part in the famous gold rush to California and endured the hardships of a journey across the plains and mountains by covered wagon. He remained in California for many years, fighting Indians, herding cattle, and panning gold from the rivers and streams. He returned to his old hometown of Wakefield in 1892. The Wakefield Water Company, in order to supply water to the villagers, had just been established. The then rather shallow pond, now called California Jim's Pond, was taken over as an auxiliary supply for the main reservoir at Rocky Brook. Mr. Northup was given the position of the guardian of the auxiliary reservoir and tending the gates which opened it into the larger reservoir. He built himself a small building to live in just north of the pond, a sort of lean-to into the bank where he kept his horse and small express wagon. These, he said, were built in California style. He also planted strawberries and cultivated blueberries on the hill just north of the pond, both of which he retailed during the summer months at Narragansett Pier. It was in this way that my rather close acquaintance with Mr. Northup began. I helped him pick strawberries and blueberries, as I recall my pay was 2 cents a box, and then we would get his express wagon loaded for the early morning trip to the pier. I would listen, entranced by his wild stories of fighting Indians — he was always victorious — and of rounding up big herds of cattle and panning gold from the California rivers and streams. The wagon was drawn by a small, rather spirited horse, which he said was also a California type, used there for speed in drawing the small wagon. After several years of raising berries and tending to the reservoir, California again beckoned. Jim was then nearly 70 years of age. Although he lived much as a hermit since his return to Wakefield, he had some rather close friends. Among them were Mr. and Mrs. Clark Allen. They lived on Allen Avenue, and he finally induced them to go with him to take up a new life in his still-loved California. Early in the spring of 1906, the trio set out. Mr. Northup abandoned his little shack at the pond and gave up his post with the water company. The Allens sold all their personal property at auction. Fortunately, they did not sell their home, and started out with Mr. Northup for a new home in the, quote, Golden West. They arrived in San Francisco the day before the famous earthquake and resulting fire, which all but completely destroyed the city. Being confused and entirely separated from each other, we can imagine what the Allens' first impressions of California must have been. No word came to relatives from any of them until about 2 weeks later, when Mrs. Allen finally arrived in Peacedale. She had no idea of the whereabouts of either her husband or Mr. Northup. Folks always said she arrived first because she could run the fastest. A week later, her husband Clark arrived home, saying he was somewhat disappointed in California and really had no desire to stay. It was almost 2 months before California Jim found his way back to Wakefield. He never went back to his old home at the pond. He stayed here and there at various places and finally came to make a home with old friends of his boyhood days, Samuel and Harrison Stedman, at the old Stedman homestead on Austin Street. There ended his eventful life on May 30th, 1915, at 85 years of age. He lies in the Northup Family Cemetery at the now Wild Acres Farm, from which he began his wild and adventurous life so many years before. I have not visited the old pond where I spent so many youthful, happy days in a long, long time. I understand it is now a part of the state's Green Acres project and has been enlarged, deepened, and stocked with fish. But I still hold in it memory as a prolific breeding place for water snakes in the summer and a lovely skating pond in winter.